All right, so the PowerPoint for Chapter 21 is a fairly extensive one. I think it's a very useful one. I'll go through that quickly. It's up on Blackboard for you to use. You'll notice that a lot of these things we've already discussed or viewed in some of the videos. Again, it's dealing with this concept of black power, black nationalism, generally this latter phase of quote-unquote the 60s and some of the debates surrounding it. So it's just titled Black Power, but it really deals with this whole kind of later period. As we said, that's sort of mid to late 60s and really early 70s and afterwards that this becomes the dominant sort of moment. Of course, Black Power doesn't start just in 1966 when Carmichael coins the term. He was building off of something, just like we've been building off of things. We've seen some of these ideas before. I mean, how often do we keep going back to Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and these folks, even at the early 20th century, and seeing how many of their ideas are still portrayed even by the mid to late 60s. So there's this heritage, as it says. It starts off talking about some of the foundations of what's going to become, quote-unquote, black power, black nationalism. We could take it back to World War II with A. Philip Randolph. Remember that whole threatened march on Washington, a kind of realization of how powerful African Americans have become as a group, especially once they have migrated to urban centers, especially as they're living in neighborhoods with thousands of people in close contact and being able to try to vote and these sorts of things. Remember, the underlying ideas, things like self-determination, self-reliance, are things we've seen before. You can trace them back, at least as far as the Booker T. Washington, like self-reliance, rely on yourself, don't count on outsiders, don't expect help from the outside world, these sorts of things. But it's going to take on a very different tone than in Washington, right? Politically, it's a very different, more militant-sounding tone. Yet it's interesting how some of the same ideas hold. Start a business, for example. This is still going to be something that is associated with black power and with a Booker T. Washington 60, 70 years earlier. Separatism, strategies often seen as necessary. Again, we could trace this back to Washington. Washington was saying, look, at least for now, we need to go ahead and be separate. Don't try to integrate. Develop some sort of economic power, and then maybe move forward from a position of strength rather than a position of weakness. We've seen some of these things, again, going back to Marcus Garvey and the Harlem Renaissance as well. It's interesting how many parallels there are going to be between the New Negro and the sort of black power, black nationalist era as well. Some of those we tried to trace through looking at Malcolm X. We only looked at him briefly. He's, as we know, such a complicated and important figure. We really haven't been able to do him justice, so definitely take a look at what's in the chapter on him and some of his speeches and things. Will give you a much better sense of his complications as a person and really his changes. Truthfully, what I admire most about Malcolm X is his ability to change. He's going to go through some tremendous changes in the course of even his relatively short, the end of his career was really short. Right after his pilgrimage, he's going to be alive about 2 years or less, but he's going to go through tremendous changes in that process and really rethink a lot of things. I think it's hard for people to rethink things that they've come to believe. I think just all people have trouble with that. Once they believe something, they just believe it no matter what. And he's going to go through certain changes based on context and based on being presented with contrary evidence. It starts off, and you can understand really his hatred for white people. I could understand it was based on his early life. His father's killed, his mother's pushed crazy, basically. He's broken up, put in the foster care system, into the system, quote unquote. Goes to jail, right? Obviously, your interactions with white society or white power, as he would say it, are not going to be positive at all. He's asked at one point about, have you met any positive whites? And whites been friendly to him. He thinks about it, he's like, no. So you can kind of understand perhaps how someone would be so standoffish about this culture that it only sort of given him negative things. Yet when he's confronted with, especially when he makes his pilgrimage, as he says, I prayed next to Muslims that were as white as any American. He's like, wait a second. He really has to rethink certain things about all whites being devils and these types of things. I think he's going through some other things too. Some feminist scholars talk about how Malcolm may have arrived at a sort of proto-feminist position had he lived, right? Just because of his ability to rethink discrimination and change, right? recognized, for example, his own abuse, essentially, of women earlier in his life. If you're pimping, you're abusing women. So his ability to change is something that I respect. His ability to reevaluate even his relationship with Martin Luther King is something that was very complicated. And again, I want you to be thinking about the connection between this era and what came before it, and also what comes afterwards. I mean, there's not that much distance between the late 60s, early 70s era and today. There really, really isn't. We trace countless examples of this. We play a lot of hip-hop music, for example, especially from the 1990s. You're going to see all sorts of references to Malcolm X, all sorts of images of the Black Panther Party, and quotes, and by any means necessary, and Martin Luther King as well, but especially this kind of Black Power feel. I told you about some of the direct connections with Afeni Shakur, for example. Direct connection between this era and sort of hip-hop culture in that sense. There are just a lot of direct parallels that we could draw and might draw. Malcolm, again, initially comes out of the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad had become a particularly important organization, both religiously and politically, I would say. Culturally, this organization was particularly important and remains very important in the African American community. Think about, for example, the work in the prisons among Black men in particular. This has a huge impact on African American people and culture to this day. So, and it's interesting. We think of that organization as being super radical, under Louis Farrakhan, especially being super radical. Yet many of their activities are really kind of conservative. Right? We think of Black nationalism as being this radical, white devil kind of blah blah blah. But for the most part, the Nation of Islam starts Black businesses. Right? They started their own businesses. Right? They believe in self-help. Don't ask the government for help. And in fact, in this era, they really wanted to stay out of American politics. It's one of the reasons Malcolm X got in trouble, was he's kind of given orders to stay away from America's politics. We're not trying to integrate into that society anyway. So don't involve yourself, don't say certain things. And Malcolm X wasn't able to do that. He thought that the organization should be more involved in pushing for African American politics. And this is part of how he gets into trouble. For example, when he comments after John F. Kennedy gets killed, he's told, don't say anything about it, because the country is in mourning, blah, 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 it's going to have a negative backlash. And Malcolm X, has his famous chickens come home to roost thing. He says, look, when you perpetuated violence on people domestically and internationally, you can't be surprised when that violence takes one of your own. He says it's like chickens coming home to roost. It's natural. This gets him, suspended for 90 days, and really is kind of the beginning of the end with this connection with the organization. So in some respects, it's really interesting to think about both the radical and the conservative aspects of, especially Black nationalism as an idea. Again, you can make direct connections between Dana White, Marcus Garvey, and Booker T. Washington, in both maybe radical and conservative ways. It's really interesting to think about that kind of timeline. They do advocate separation. Separation. They're not trying to advocate for integration. They don't think integration is going to work. Very much like a Garvey, very much like a Booker T. Washington, decades earlier. So it's interesting how these ideas cycle back through and seem to come back into prominence in many ways. Malcolm is seen as one of the most vocal opponents of the civil rights movement. One of the things we see about Black nationalism as an idea in this period is that it tends to be very critical of white racism, but I think you would find in any Malcolm X speech, he's just as critical of African Americans as he is of whites. In fact, more so, quite often. He puts a lot of the blame for how African Americans were continuing to be treated on African Americans themselves. Kind of like Marcus Garvey. Garvey said, look, you're uneducated, you need to clean yourself up and expect certain things and be men and these types of things. You hear a lot of that same rhetoric from Malcolm X. Yet he also would criticize white racism, poor housing, poor education. He considered himself a revolutionary. And he thought that the civil rights movement was a little too reformist. Now, what's the difference between reform on one hand and revolution on the other? We can kind of give a basic kind of working definition of that distinction. Most civil rights activists thought that the society needed to be reformed, which is fixed. That there was something broken with it, but it could be fixed. There's a hope that you could take documents like the Constitution, right? Take documents like the Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights. These are great documents, great ideas about individual freedom and liberty. They're just not applied. They're just not applied to African Americans and people of color and poor people and women. So they said the problem is not the documents, it's people and their unwillingness to actually apply them. So a reformer like a Martin Luther King is going to take these documents and hold them up to American society and say, you're hypocrites. You don't follow your own rules. You don't follow your own guidelines. You need to do that. And when you do that, the society will be a better place. So that's one perspective, right? The reform aspect. It can be fixed. Think of it like a broken car. You got a car, you like it though. It's in pretty good shape. But, you know, you might need some new tires on it. Seats laid a little bit. You need an oil change, right? So you like, now, it's worth putting that money in and fixing it. Now I have a car. I can get where I need to go. Malcolm X and others that consider themselves revolutionaries said, you know what, that reform stuff doesn't make any sense. The system itself is broken. The system itself is broken. So Malcolm would say, how can we count on a constitution that justifies slavery? Somebody got some headphones or something? How can we count on a document like the Bill of Rights that wasn't meant to be applied to African Americans and hope that that's going to save African Americans? Revolutionaries say, you know what, we need to throw it all out. Throw out the baby with the bathwater, let's start over. The government itself is corrupt. So how can you ask the government to end corruption, right? And this is the essential difference. One thinks the system can be fixed, one thinks the system cannot be fixed. And so you see the difference in their kind of tactics because they have different goals. Malcolm X doesn't think you could integrate or should integrate into a society that is on its way out, essentially. And so you see a lot of these differences in their rhetoric. Again, many of Malcolm X's speeches are talking to the African American community, this idea of audience. Others are going to be talking to whites. Ballot or the bullet, for example. He says essentially there's a choice coming. Either the ballot or the bullet. If you don't exercise or give people political freedom, then they're ultimately going to choose other means. Violence might be one of the means that they choose. A lot of the activism we've seen has been regional, right? Of course, much of the civil rights is going to occur in the South where, despite the migration and such, people are still heavily concentrated in. By 1970, about 50% of African Americans have left the South. So we're getting more of a concentration outside of the South. But much of it still occurs in the South. One of the things we tried to do with the Congested Terrain article was to complicate how we normally think of these phases and stages of civil rights. Right? We normally think of just legalism and then just nonviolent direct action and then black power, black nationalism. But there really is overlap between the two. You said Malcolm X and Martin Luther King overlap themselves. So someone like a Gloria Richardson, for example, who's discussed in chapter 21, she is involved in both nonviolent direct action and in ideas about self-defense. And this article's talking about how some of the same marches, you might have some folks that were nonviolent activists and then other folks that were in favor of self-defense at some of the same marches. Sometimes there was conflict around who was going to win out, who was going to be the leader of these marches, right? What direction they might go. Yes, sir.
When like King and Malcolm X, when they were like going around cities, did they have bodyguards or they just did?
That's a good question. Malcolm, yeah, the fruit of Islam is one aspect of the security force that was in charge of security for the Nation of Islam. And again, I think I may have mentioned this example. At one point, again, we think of Malcolm X and King as being enemies and separate. At one point, Malcolm admitted using allowing his security forces to actually make sure King was okay, because King tended to just roll with people. You know, he had a kind of close group of folks, and I think the safety was kind of just in the numbers and the public nature of it all. But from time to time, there were security. Let me give you an example of using King. Again, King is always about nonviolence, right? King's house gets bombed, right? His kids almost get killed, firebomb, they throw a Molotov cocktail in the window and whatnot. And at that point, people hear about this, and several folks rush to King's house. The mob forming outside King's house. A lot of them bring their pistols, shotguns. They're like, this is it. Let's go. It's time. King has to really make probably one of his more important speeches to the crowd. Like, you can't relax, because a lot of folks are like, oh, this is it. We're not doing this anymore. They felt responsible enough for his safety, his family's safety, that they were willing to go kill folks. And he has to kind of like, ruin everything we work for and this and that. So in that maybe informal sense, yeah, sometimes police would look out. I think chapter 21 mentions this kind of race beat. In some cities, they assign certain police because they don't want anything to happen in their city to these folks. So they would assign cops to follow them. As we progress, CIA, FBI, starts following folks, so that could be considered security, or it could be considered just surveillance. And this is why some folks say, well, how did they get killed? And all these folks following them. This is why some folks think about conspiracies and whatnot developing. But yeah, it tended to be both informal and formal meetings, I would say. But things have happened, and things and ultimately both of them do die violently. A couple other quick groups that they mentioned, the Deacons of Defense, for example, are an interesting one. Many of them coming out of the NAACP and other nonviolent groups. But the Deacons of Defense, they basically set up a mini army. They take on the Klan in places like North Carolina. Robert Williams and others and other organizations would come to take on and think about armed revolution as a possibility. They say, yeah, we like nonviolent protests, but we got guns too, just in case this doesn't go right. A lot of people are really thinking about complicating this rhetoric. Even before a group like the Black Panther Party, you have groups like Robert Williams in North Carolina challenging the Klan, kind of daring the Klan. Sometimes them providing security themselves for other nonviolent groups. Talked about the Black Panther Party quite a bit yesterday. A couple of visual sources on them and their organization. They're also another very complicated organization. Can't possibly do them justice in a couple of classes or a week, but they are themselves really, really complicated. It's one of the reasons I put the excerpts up from the book, The Black Panther Speaks. The first one was a list of their rules. Their rules are really interesting. They're saying things like, no drugs, right? You can't use any drugs or be drunk while you're working for the party. Don't curse or this and that. Now, on some level, those were rules, and then ultimately, many of those rules get broken. Part of the reason for the downfall of the Panthers, many Panthers will tell you, is drug use became an issue. Folks started getting high, especially as heroin kind of kicked in. That became a problem. But literally, in the bylaws, you could be kicked out, you could be suspended, you're considered anti-revolutionary for breaking these rules. Don't attack anyone in the community. You're supposed to be defending the community. Again, sometimes that got a little crazy. Because what happens if someone in the community stands up to the party or refuses to go along? Panthers are interesting, and I'll give you an example. Again, they consider themselves revolutionary nationalists. They consider the major problem to be class and imperialism. That racism was kind of a part of that. So I'm going to give you an example of one of the things the Panthers did that maybe confused some, but for them it made perfect sense. Panthers were involved in what they called the Boyette boycott. Boyette boycott. Boyette was the last name of a liquor store owner in, I don't know if it was Oakland, I can't remember what city, but in one of basically the neighborhoods in the hood that the Panthers considered themselves defending. They came to look at this person as being non-revolutionary. You had this liquor store, all you're doing is pushing especially cheap and dangerous liquor to the community. You're not giving anything back to the community. We're going to boycott you. We're going to launch a boycott. It doesn't sound too revolutionary. That doesn't sound too crazy. Well, Boyette was black. So Boyette's like, what are you doing? I'm African American business owner, this and that. But they're like, look, it's not about your race. It's about the fact that we see you as like a leech on the community, only destroy the community. And so they boycott him. I don't know ultimately what happened with that boycott, but it gives you a sense of this isn't just about black versus white for them. There was other issues involved in terms of liberation and improving the community. Now, maybe if he had used some of his profits and put them back in the community, maybe they could have worked something out. I don't know. But it's interesting to think about class as this kind of major part of this discussion. A large part of this discussion, and the chapter does a better job of dealing with this, is how the movement's going to become internationalized. Part of what we need to be thinking about in the 60s is an interracial movement. It's not just about African Americans, right? We have various people of color coming together in some pretty notable ways. 1968, for example, there are several strikes on campuses around the country. San Francisco State, for example, has a major strike where there are African American students Latino, Chicano students, Asian American students, all coming together and saying, look, there are problems in the educational system and in society, and we're going to address them. A lot of what comes out of this is the development of ethnic studies departments. So ethnic studies in the Bay Area, for example, will start right around that period. Right? You get African American history classes, Chicano studies, Asian American studies developed, right, as kind of correctives to traditional American history, traditional American literature that tended to leave out people of color. So it's interesting to see these cross-racial alliances, and it's very important, in fact, to keep that in mind. And also internationally, this is not a new thing. Malcolm X himself attends the Bandung Conference in Asia. He attends this conference and says, look, the African American struggle should be linked to a much wider human rights freedom struggle. He says, why are we just protesting against the U.S. government and asking them to kind of fix themselves? He says we need to make this an international movement. Many people think this is part of what makes Malcolm X so dangerous, or seen as so dangerous. Not just that he was saying kind of outlandish things, white people are devils, blonde hair, blah, 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 white people smell like dogs, all these kind of things that got a reaction. I mean, he was saying that since the 50s. Right? How do they let him live another 10 years? Some people say he truly gets dangerous, especially after his Hajj, when he comes back, when he's willing to work with any group that's in favor of progress, basically, and also when he begins to really, really push the international dimensions of human rights. For example, Malcolm X makes contact and patterns an organization after the Organization of African Unity, the organization among African nations, the Organization of African Unity. He calls his organization the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and patterns it, and he makes direct connections with many African leaders. One of the things he says is that these leaders especially should bring charges against the United States. They should take the United States before the World Court for human rights violations, kind of bring them up on charges. He says, look, what sense does it make to petition the U.S. government when the U.S. government's the problem? He says, that's like, you have a case of police brutality, what do you do, call the police? Well, you kind of have to, right? Because in a sense, they're the ones responsible for safety, yet you might not always feel completely comfortable in doing that. You might be calling a guy's partner that just beat you up. So he says, take it to the World Court. Some people see this as particularly important. Right? The government would have been heavily embarrassed by this, especially during the Cold War. The U.S. is putting out all this rhetoric about democracy, and how all nations of the world should become democratic and not go follow the Soviet Union. Right? This would be very embarrassing and damaging, perhaps, to American foreign policy. Some people say this is when he becomes particularly dangerous, beginning in the Bandung Conference and afterwards, as some of the things I just mentioned here. Making this struggle international and not just limiting it to the U.S. King also is going to begin to expand his scope, many say, in his last couple of years. Some people say this is what makes King truly dangerous, not just when he's saying things about race. But what about when King comes out against Vietnam, 1966? When Martin Luther King gets killed, he is in Memphis, Tennessee. He is supporting a sanitation workers strike in Memphis, Tennessee, an interracial sanitation workers strike, not just about black workers, although Memphis has a lot of black people. So some say this is more about class activism at that point. He's questioning economic relationships, and that this is truly revolutionary. A lot of folks think this might be even more revolutionary than just asking for the right to vote. Both of these figures are going to die within 3 years of each other. Malcolm X is killed in 65, and although a lot of his ideas are going to live on and take other directions through black nationalism, black power. Talked about Stokely Carmichael. I think you got a good sense of the images and the conflicts around black power through that video. Again, I think it's actually a very helpful video in that respect. Carmichael himself is important. Carmichael is interesting because not only does he coin the term black power, not only does he come out of King's nonviolent direct action tradition and SNCC, but he becomes one of the leaders of SNCC, and ultimately SNCC and the Black Panther Party unite. Around 66, 67, they actually combine for a time. It doesn't work out ultimately, but it's interesting how they literally combine. They literally come together, start working together. and this is seen as particularly radical for some. The 10-point program. The 10-point program are the 10 points that the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense puts out when they're founded. This is what we want, they basically say, what we believe. They're 10 points, and you'll see, I actually put a copy of the handout online on the blackboard. But you see some of the things that they're asking for. Many of them have to do with civil rights and race. Just as many have to do with class. Asking for better schools. They're asking for Black men to be exempt from military service. They said the society is racist. Why should you fight for a government that doesn't respect you and give you second-class citizenship? Better housing. All these various things that seem like basic human rights are laid out in the Black Panther Party 10-point platform. Really interesting document in this sense, kind of epitomizes them more generally. It's a picture of Huey Newton sitting in this is a famous one, sitting in the famous chair. Sort of African imagery to it, but in the beret, leather jacket. Again, the imagery itself is important. This kind of militancy, significance to talk about COINTELPRO. Come back to that in a second. Black nationalism as a male-centered culture. Now, this is going to be an important and interesting aspect too, because much of what folks end up discussing is kind of racial advancement, right, being discriminated against because of your race, but also gender. So attacks on quote-unquote black manhood. So a lot of the rhetoric that you hear, we saw in the video last time, the Black Power, White Backlash, is freedom articulated through the lens of gender. We want to be free to be men. We should be able to control our own communities and families, right? Be men again and protect our women. So again, theoretically, there's nothing wrong with any of that. But sometimes that may go a bit far. So, for example, you say, I want to be able to protect my women. So some women are like, wait a second, I don't belong to you. We're talking about my women. Right? This notion of possession. It's interesting that a black feminist movement is exploding at the same time that this sort of black power, black nationalist movement. And sometimes there may be differing goals. So some women are saying, look, I want to be free not to need any man. Not to be able to have to rely on any man. Get my own job and do this and that, right? So I'm not dependent on anyone. So a lot of folks are going to define power and freedom differently in this period. Yet I think if you're an African-American woman at this point, right, you might have many ties with black power, black nationalism. You want, black power to be free, and people to be free as well. Yet there may be problems with that. There's problems with violence against women within the Black Panther Party. So some women say, oh, I'm not playing with that. We go over here to the feminist movement. Well, the feminist movement at this point is predominantly white women. Many black women complained about the racism of white feminists. So if you're a black woman, you have some interesting choices. Do I go along with this black power movement that may hurt me in some ways? Or do I go with the white feminist movement that may be racist in some ways? Some black women are going to chart a different course and do things like black feminism or womanism. They argue that it's different than white feminism. Stokely Carmichael has a famous quote. He's asked, what is the position of black women in the revolution? He's asked by a reporter, I think. And he says, prone, basically laying down. So he kind of articulates that their position is just to make babies. A lot of women are like, wait a second, what am I fighting for then if that's all you think of me as? That's a major kind of moment where prone. Kathleen Cleaver, who was also a member of the Black Panther Party, is asked, said, what's the role of women in the movement? And she says, why are you asking me that? Nobody asked what the role of a man is in the revolution. Why have you been asking that question? So it's interesting that the voices that women especially are going to bring to this debate. As you're freeing quote-unquote black people, make sure that you're not bringing enslaving black women. COINTELPRO, mentioned that last time. That was the FBI program, Counterintelligence Program is what it stood for, acronym for that. And it was an attempt to disrupt groups like the Panthers, the attempt to disrupt and to neutralize, as they often said, these organizations seen as particularly radical and dangerous. Wiretaps, letters written back and forth, to sort of stir up controversy, sometimes direct attacks on Black Panther Party headquarters. A lot of Panthers get arrested, constantly harassed. Some get hung over about such. Some of them get shot. Fred Hampton, I mentioned Fred Hampton last time, 21-year-old leader in Chicago that many argue was seen as particularly dangerous because his star seemed to be rising, that he might be able to become another Martin Luther King. And he's shot down in his apartment about 3 in the morning by police, along with Mark Clark. Mark Clark was also killed. The Panthers did have enemies. I mentioned this last time. Right? They saw themselves as revolutionary nationalists. They thought the political system itself had to change. There was a branch of kind of black power and black nationalism that dealt more with what they call cultural nationalism. So you see a lot of folks in this period wearing African garb, as they said, or natural hair, deciding black is beautiful, that grows out of this era. The Panthers had problems with some of the organizations that were in favor of cultural nationalism. One group in particular, the US organization, US, U.S., stood for United Slaves. This is an organization started by a guy named Karenga, who's still alive. He teaches black studies out in California to this day. Probably most famous for Karenga is the creator of Kwanzaa. Everybody know Kwanzaa is? Holiday, it comes after Christmas, starts the day after Christmas, deals with the 7 principles and whatnot, very African, Afrocentric in its development. So he starts this in the 70s. But the Panthers are like, you're doing all this, Kwanzaa stuff and renaming yourself and natural hair. That's not real revolution, the Panthers would say. And us, they thought that they had, really a better vision of what revolution should look like, at least potential, especially in cities where both of them were prominent, like the Bay Area cities and Los Angeles in particular. They had major clashes, and some actually, there were shootings between the two of them. Part of what the COINTELPRO did was write letters to the Panthers from us members and say, I'm going to kill, when I see you on the street, you're dead. Right? So then the Panthers were like, well, okay, when we see them, it's going to be on, so make sure you're armed, make sure your safety's off. These groups see each other, right? Whether those letters were real or not, quite often it made for violence.
But I thought the rules for the Panthers that they couldn't carry a weapon and stuff like that.
Couldn't carry a weapon?
Yeah.
Actually, well, there's 2 versions of, I don't know which year those laws were. There's actually 2 versions of the 10-point platform, one in 66, the very beginning, and one in 72. 66, when they started, it's legal, especially in California, to carry weapons. And that was actually part of their uniform in some senses. At some point, it's going to become problematic. You had to follow certain rules. Maybe you could have the shotgun, but you had to have the ammunition in the trunk, or maybe you had to have both of them in the trunk. Maybe it had to be unloaded. So there's going to be some differences there. But they were strapped. They were strapped consistently and constantly. And again, in some areas that wasn't a problem because it wasn't illegal. Gun laws have changed, and gun laws tend to vary from state to state. But especially after the Mulford anti-gun bill in California, it might become more problematic, and especially once the Panthers are more notorious. But yeah, that was a major part of their I would say part of their uniform. In fact, it was almost considered irresponsible not to have a weapon. One of the violent outbreaks that breaks out is this, again, I mentioned last time, a fatal shooting on the campus of UCLA. The first time I was doing this class, I was teaching in a building called Campbell Hall at UCLA, where I went to school. And I didn't know some of this history yet. I'm reading the stuff, and they're like, yeah, there's a shooting in the basement of Campbell Hall. I'm like, so the kids were freaking out, like, because we were in the building, we were studying it, and in the basement was where the shooting had happened. It used to be kind of the center for the BSU on campus, and there was this tension that developed between the two, and stuff jumped off there. Folks, Bunchy Carter, John Huggins, there was some violence, and some folks died. Some Panthers were killed. So this was serious stuff. Mentioned Muhammad Ali last time. He's a member of the Nation of Islam. He does not feel like he should follow the Selective Service Act and support a war that he didn't believe in. Right? According to his religious beliefs, he's supposed to kill folks. So he refuses. Yet it's going to land him in jail. That is going to take his title from him. So there could be some implications to standing up for what you believed in politically, especially if you were associated with any of these more radical organizations. A lot of this is young people. One of the reasons I want you to see these images is because a lot of this has to do with people your age and younger, especially on college campuses. You guys tend to be the revolution. You guys are the one that are looking at the world and saying, okay, are things getting better or are they getting worse? I'm old. I could fall out tomorrow. You know, you guys got a long life ahead of you. So a lot of times young people are like, I'm not willing to deal with things the way they are. You guys also tend to be impatient. Tend to be impatient. Sometimes that can be a good thing. You're not willing to go with a slow pace of change and maybe march for 8, 9, 10 years and get beaten up. And young folks are like, wish they would. So in some respects, young people, I think, help change the pace of civil rights in this era. And you see a lot of things around, especially students and campuses. The civil rights movement leads directly into the anti-war movement. Again, as Vietnam becomes more and more unpopular in the United States, this is not just African Americans or people of color. White students start to protest the war in large numbers. There are major protests on college campuses. Some of them get killed. There are several famous massacres that happened. The Orangeburg in South Carolina, Kent State is in Ohio in 1970. Predominantly white students, and it was a predominantly white school. National Guard opens fire on them. Several of them died. People thought that Vietnam might lead to another civil war here in the U.S. This is how unpopular that conflict became, and people protesting against it get seen as un-American by many in power. Yet for them, for these students, they say, look, we're the ones fighting the war. Young people tend to be the ones in service that are fighting and dying. So as you saw more and more body bags come back, a lot of folks get turned off by the war. The Vietnam War is going to change the way that we fight wars. It's going to change the way that we televise wars. They used to televise these firefights and things in Vietnam. They used to televise the body bags being taken off the planes and brought back. Right? They used to give you a daily count every day of how many folks got killed. And over time, folks start to lose their mind a little bit. As a country, we're like, what's going on? It was America's longest conflict. We get involved in that in the early 60s. And it's going to last, until 1975 or so. So for 10, 12, 14 years or so, folks are saying, what's going on? And we lose. We're not winning. There seems to be no end in sight. So a lot of folks become disaffected and start connecting civil rights at home to these wars abroad that didn't seem to be working in their favor. The black professors and administrators increased. Thank goodness. Right? Otherwise, maybe I couldn't have been up here. African American history is a good example of this. African American history was primarily taught by whites until very recently. Very recently. There are some reasons for that. There weren't very many African Americans in graduate school. That's one reason. Again, not that there's anything wrong with anybody that wants to teach African American history. To this day, I don't even know if it's a majority of African Americans or not. If anything, it's probably close to even, right? But this does open up certain opportunities for African American students that want to go on and be college professors, because you usually require an advanced degree, a master's degree or a PhD. Programs like affirmative action are going to come out of civil rights. Affirmative action actually is born in the 1960s. Comes from a phrase from Lyndon Johnson. Johnson says, basically, look, we've been changing these laws, but we haven't really been doing anything real to make equality a real thing. He says we need to take affirmative steps in that direction. We need to take action, affirmative action. Right, so this is where you start to get certain programs put in place, like, okay, let's have competitive bidding for government contracts, or let's think about opening up traditionally white institutions to people of color, to women. Right? So maybe changing guidelines for who gets accepted. I'll give you a quick example. UCLA, back when I was first going there were 38 different factors that they looked at for you to get accepted. We think that it's just about your GPA, right? But that's not the case. They look at your extracurricular activities, they look at all this other stuff, where you're in student government, you volunteer, right? All these sorts of things in order to round out the student population, the student body, to increase diversity. Right? Diversity can mean any number of things. Some folks say, look, if you go to a school that only has wealthy white men, are you learning everything you need to learn, right, by interacting with them? Are you learning about different people's perspective? Not really. So some people say this is one good reason to have people of color, their numbers increase. One good reason to have women on campus. So affirmative action is going to be really, really important, not just for people of color, but for women. Opens up higher education for women as never before. As we know now, most universities are predominantly women. That was not the case before the 1970s. It's not the case. So it really opens up. And the question is about opportunity of equality, or equality of opportunity, opening up traditionally limited and closed institutions to people of color and to women in particular. Major beneficiaries, the people that are going to benefit the most are actually women. But affirmative action gets read as this program that's only about race. It's not the case. Talked about kind of Black is Beautiful movement, right? This develops along with this as well. Literature is actually a very similar moment to what we talked about with the Harlem Renaissance in the 1970s. You have all these artists producing art around an African American cultural and life, rethinking Africa as a kind of as a center, as an inspiration for our art and culture. It's called the Black Arts Movement. Black Arts Movement, especially in the 1970s, goes right along with this notion of Black power and rethinking questions of beauty. Black is Beautiful is a part of that. Blaxploitation. I don't really have time to talk about this stuff, but if you watch Blaxploitation movies, you'll notice that most of them are in the 1970s. This idea about Black characters, central characters, but really not upstanding figures for the most part, right? Drug dealers and whatnot. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to ask, what do you think about Ben Carson running for president?
It'll be interesting. He's Republican, right? It'll be interesting.
Yeah, he's a conservative.
He's what?
He's a conservative.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of folks are, a lot of African Americans are more conservative in most things than we might think. Things like religion, for example, African Americans tend to be very conservative. So maybe he'll be formidable. He's pretty famous. I would think that he would have run, say a while ago, because he was more famous, I think, before. But I think Obama's opened up the possibility of an African American president or a woman president. We'll see. It's going to be interesting. There's going to be, I think, some interesting characters that will come out of the woodwork and run. Hillary, of course, I think Michelle needs to get in there. So we don't even have to move. We can just go ahead and move in. That's what I vote for, Michelle. But it'll be interesting, I think, to see. I don't know his politics at all. I can't really say specifically anything about what he's down for cutting student loans. I vote for him. That's the main crisis in this country now, student loans. Don't let me see Sally Mae on the street. I'm tired of you. It's going to be interesting now to see these upcoming elections. A lot of this stuff is that we don't need to go through. It's talking about connections between the artists. This is some interesting stuff about women, again, really sort of growing out of notions of Black feminism. A lot of the writers are going to be raised in this culture of Black feminism and Black power, and really dealing with the questions around both. What's that?
Oh, so it's kind of like a Harlem Renaissance.
Very similar in some ways to the Harlem Renaissance. Figures like Amiri Baraka, the poet that just died recently, very radical in their poetry. Toni Morrison is one, Alice Walker, and so some of the stuff that we should become familiar with, like The Color Purple, was a Pulitzer Prize, and then it's made into a movie in 1984, I believe. If you haven't seen that movie, it's a movie. Make you cheer up a little bit. It was on TV the other day. I'm like, I'm gonna cry today. It's a good story, and really with Black women at the center of it. And think about what that story is about. Right? It's about these two sisters, and one sister in particular who is going through various things, right? Her husband is oppressive. What's his name? Danny Glover. You hate Danny Glover by the end of that movie. I mean, he's abusive to her, and I like Danny Glover. He's like, because he's such a good bad guy in that. Right? He's torturing her essentially. She's kind of overcoming all of this over time, right? So think of that theme. Right? It's about racial oppression. They go through the depression in the 40s and all that kind of stuff. But it's also about Black women and Black men. It's really interesting to think about the complexity of some of these things. What's that?
Didn't that win the Academy Award?
I believe so. I know Steven Spielberg was part of producing it. He talks about how important that was. I forget all the awards it won. Whoopi Goldberg was the central figure in it. Become a Broadway play at some point as well. Moynihan, remember I told you about the figure, and if you watch more of the Black Power, White Backlash video, you saw Daniel Moynihan. I told you about his controversial report that he writes. Again, his report, they're saying, what's wrong with black people, basically. Moynihan writes this report. In many ways, he kind of blames the collapse of the black family and black women for that, right?
The white guy that was presented? The white guy that was presented?
Yeah, he's Daniel Moynihan is white. He was an advisor to several presidents, in fact, senator out of Massachusetts. And so he comes out with a Moynihan report, it was called. So it said, clearly blames female-headed households for what he called a tangle of pathology. It says the problems in the black community, crime and unwed mothers, it's basically women's fault. Men are not men anymore in this issue. It's very seen as negative. Women are too bossy, right? Black women are too loud. These kind of stereotypes of black women kind of came up in terms of this political, and he had certain recommendations. One of them was more black men should join the military to become men again and, stand up and, take over their communities, these kinds of things. So in some ways, it's kind of very traditional response, right? And it's interesting because Moynihan is actually seen as pretty favorable to civil rights. He was in favor of black power. Yet, again, his ideas and many of the ideas at the time were still seen as, in some ways, stereotypical. It's interesting that he's not kind of an outright racist in any way, yet he still has these kind of fundamental flaws, some might say. And there's going to be a major reaction to this, especially when folks are thinking about black women's image in contemporary culture. Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you think about the way that the little, I guess, investigative report was presented?
The investigative report?
Yeah, what we watched, the way CBS presented it.
Oh, the Black Power, White Backlash?
Yeah.
What do you think about it? That's a better question. What do you guys think of that Black Power, White Backlash in terms of what you saw, what you remember? What stood out to you? What struck you about Black Power as a discourse?
Well, to me, I thought the way that the white guy was presenting it was he was kind of being fair, kind of asking some good questions, kind of making a follow up on it, and then he was more vanilla, though, in a way that he wasn't trying to push his own opinion about it. He was trying to ask some good investigative questions.
Good journalist in that sense.
Yeah.
Every now and then he puts them out there poking prod, but yeah, I think in many ways he was trying to be, for the most part, maybe fair, especially for that time period. This is Mike Wallace, if you didn't know him, I used to watch him growing up on 60 Minutes, which is still on today. So he was doing it for a long time. He's a very respected journalist. And the reason I like it is because it really is a primary source. This comes out in '66. This is what people would have been seeing on TV. It's one thing to have a primary source like that. It's another thing to maybe read in the textbook that Black Power was seen as controversial. People talked about this. And it's different just kind of see what people were saying and talking about. And that's why I like it, its presentation. The second half of it is interesting too. In the second half of it, they actually interview a number of whites. Right? And what are their thoughts on Black Power? What are their thoughts on the civil rights movement? So they interview one. There's a lady standing on her porch, and a little girl's out there. She says, "What do you think about civil rights?" She's kind of like, "I just don't want them living next to me. My house values could go down, this and that, blah blah blah." Right? It's really interesting. Some people didn't consider themselves racist, but they're like, "Look, black people they move to the neighborhood. House values go down. It's an economic argument for them. Right? Can't get a loan. Crime rates go up." So some of this stuff is stereotypical. Some of it people would think of as maybe more complicated, and especially around this threat that they saw in this term Black Power. A lot of it had to do with that term Black Power. They saw violence, they saw danger, they saw this and that. Yet just as many African Americans define it in any number of ways. For many of them, it meant better schools. For many of them, it meant having a grocery store in your community. I was watching this stuff in Baltimore the other day, and one of the reporters is like, "Can't find a good grocery store. Where do people buy fresh fruit?" So he really started thinking about institutional structures. Why is it in certain neighborhoods you got access to whatever you need, and others you don't? And will that lead to frustration? There's a story about Freddie Gray, lead poisoning, and him suffering certain things in school, memory loss and things because of lead poisoning. That tends to be a problem in poor communities. So they really were trying to make this institutional argument, right, about some of the difficulties of both race and class, and then maybe what develops out of them. So, this is complicated stuff, and I want you to think about it in complicated ways.
I wonder what it would have been like what they had done it like maybe like 2 to 3 years earlier, because you know it kind of would have been a little bit interesting that we kind of got a perspective of maybe like Malcolm X or somebody like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That was done, yeah, in '66, a year after Malcolm was. And in some respects, we can look at Malcolm's speeches and get a sense of what he might have had to say about these things. And I think that he, in many ways, it's interesting. He's not being asked those questions, but he's really responding to those things. Like he talks constantly about better housing and education, all the same themes that folks are later going to deem important. And it really sort of thinking about him when they articulate these things. What direction is that going to lead people? I mean, it's going to lead in a number of different directions. Part of what's interesting about this period is that things lead so many different directions. For example, a book and a movie like Color Purple. So some people say, okay, let's use culturally, make a statement. Shirley Chisholm comes out of the black feminist movement, comes out of civil rights. She's going to run for president in 1972. You don't know her name, you should. There are a number of women here in D.C. that are important that are mentioned in the chapter. Eleanor Holmes Norton, for example, that's still around. So there are just so many directions. Some people say, I'm going to become a college professor. I want to, be a doctor or a lawyer, be a kind of symbol for the community. And so there's so much that comes out of this era that we're still sort of seeing. There's also some negatives, right? What some would see as negatives, at least. Questions of violence, for example. Watts explodes in '65. Baltimore explodes in '68. So we can think about even some of the contemporary events as having origins of this period. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, I find it so interesting how even though they never got to interview Malcolm X, sort of, even today, seems to sort of still respond to questions that we might have. So
In some ways, it shows a bit of flexibility and the timelessness of a lot of what he was saying. The fact that he's not interviewed about these things. He doesn't even last long enough to hear that term Black Power get coined. Yet so much of what he was saying seemed to fit perfectly in that. Even some of the problems you hear on now. I mean, folks are being interviewed about Baltimore. It relates specifically, I think, to this later period. Questions of class, questions of economics come out of this. That is an interesting one. Right? Between 1949 and 1964, kind of the heyday of civil rights, unemployment rate of blacks doubled that of whites. So a lot of folks are saying, look, what does it matter if you can vote? You can't feed your family. Some folks are saying, look, class is just as important or more important. 80% held jobs at the bottom of the economic ladder. There are riots that coincide with this, especially when people feel disaffected, disillusioned, separated from their societies. Part of what the civil rights movement does do, it's successful at, is changing laws. Laws are going to be changed. I get to go to a school I probably wouldn't have been able to go to school, yet there are these other events that have to be dealt with, especially as people become more and more disillusioned. Right? The Watts riots, think about the issues that are underlying it in the minds of some. 1/6 crowd into area 4 times as congested as the rest of the city. So Watts is this crowded, congested area. Some say, parts of Baltimore might be like that, parts of D.C. might be like that, parts of many urban cities can't afford to live elsewhere. More than 30% unemployed, many underemployed, underpaid, no health insurance, right? These issues that are underlying issues that when something sparks it can lead to much wider violence. Yet you also are seeing new levels of black political power, especially as these cities grow. So you can maybe have enough people to elect a black mayor if you feel like they're doing things in your interest. Right? Or a black state's attorney here in Baltimore. Yeah, that state's attorney when She announced the charges against the officer. She was moving her neck, everything. She was serious. People asked her some crazy questions. She wasn't. she's not playing. Interesting to see that or even have that in place. That would not have been the case before the 1970s. Yet, part of what the movement does not do is solve the issue of poverty. Part of what it does not do is solve the issue of poverty, especially among African American community and people of color, but just generally. Lyndon Johnson has a program for the war on poverty that he puts in place. Yet it ends. Vietnam is so expensive that he can't continue what he calls the war on poverty here at home. The war really kind of kills it. And you're going to see how, in some respects, civil rights are successful in some ways, but they don't solve some of these fundamental problems, especially around things like class and this issue of class. And some folks say that's where they really should have been focused. That those are the real issues in the minds of many. What does it matter if I can go to Harvard if I don't have dinner tonight, for my children?
I always forget, what was the reason why we went to Vietnam?
It really was the Cold War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union are butting heads, but they never fight directly. Right? So it's Russia on one hand has a communist system, economic system, and they feel like that's superior. The U.S. on the other hand has a supposedly democratic capitalist system. They're really seen as enemies of each other, and they're competing for the loyalty of all the other countries. Right? They're trying to essentially you have to decide you're going to follow the U.S. path, you're going to follow the Soviet path. So after World War II, when we were allies, all of a sudden now we're looking at each other like two bullies on the block. Right? And so they really find themselves for the next 40, 50 years suspicious, and there's tensions, and they are competing. Right? We don't want communism to spread. They don't want capitalism to spread. So in order to keep them from spreading, this policy of containment and such that we called it, we try to limit it. Okay, let's just keep it there. Like, don't let it spread to China, because China becomes communist in 1949. That freaks us out. We don't want to spread to Vietnam, ultimately. Korea. So we fight a war in Korea in the 1950s, and then in Vietnam. We pick up for the French. The French lose. That was a French colony. They get kicked out, essentially, by the Vietnamese people. So we kind of take over, like, okay, we'll help you out. And we lose, too. So really it had to do with containing communism. We thought the domino theory is another term. If we let communism's governments take over there, then they would spread closer and closer, and eventually we'd be fighting communists, in Baltimore. So some people see it now as a illogical theory, but at the time, folks were real worried about this. We, expected nuclear war. We thought Russia was going to attack us. They thought we were going to attack them. It was serious stuff, but it ultimately led to never us fighting directly, but we fought indirectly in different places. Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s. We were there 20 years later. Right? So it's interesting how indirectly a lot of this Cold War stuff leads to violence and death, but it really never happened directly. But we considered it threatening the entire time, basically. Several of these videos I think may be interesting for you. We watched the March on Washington already. These were some of the questions. I'm going to play this one on King on economic justice. King's final speech is an interesting one, too. He gives his speech the night before he dies. I'm going to play a couple of these for you.